Welcome everybody to this global launch of Stories to Light the Night. And what a wonderful celebration it is, with you all over the world, waking up or late at night. It's fine for us in Stroud in Gloucestershire, England, because it's 9 o'clock in the morning. But for Susan, it's 9 o'clock, 9 p.m. Is it, Susan?
8 p.m. 8 p.m. here.
8 p.m. So that's great.
Quite civilized.
Yes. So this book offers a real light in the night that's so topical. It's said that a picture paints 1,000 words, but a story paints 1,000 pictures. And that's why this book matters. So thank you for all coming. And from a list of people in chat, there's Croatia, there's Slovenia, there's Bulgaria, there's Romania, there's South Korea, there's China, there's all over the world, Australia, America. So thank you for all coming. It's quite amazing what opportunities Zoom gives for all its difficulties. And so thank you all for the 34, is it 34, 35
contributors to the book, yes.
For the book. It's, thank you all for your gifts. And thank you also, Susan, for orchestrating the book, and for the Hawthorn Press team. That's Katie, our commissioning editor and technical whiz, who's also contributed to the crafts at the back of the book, some of the craft projects, like the memory bank blanket, Susie Emery and Claire Percival for producing the book. So my name's Martin Large, I'm the publisher, and just an overview of this, it's quick 50 minutes, is how did this book arise, then introducing the panel, and then questions to the three members of the panel. And there may be one or two questions you ask in chat that Susan may pick up at the end. And we'll know it's ending because John, Susan's husband, will come in, hint, hint, with a bottle of champagne and a couple of glasses. So that'll be the hint. So firstly, why this book? I don't know if you can see this. It may be backwards way round. It's called Muddles, Puddles and Sunshine. And Hawthorn published it with Winston's Wish in 2000, and it's for bereaved children, and it's a creative activity book. So when Susan's Healing Stories, you may remember this, Susan's Healing Stories, again, is it backwards way round? Is it the wrong way round?
No, it's showing the right way, Martin, it's all good.
Okay, thank you. When Healing Stories came around, I always thought that, the stories for grieving and for bereavement and for loss might be somewhere down the line. So in our storytelling series, it was wonderful when these questions came and Susan agreed, was it 3 years ago, 4 years ago, to start collecting stories for loss, for separation, for communities, children, and adults and families. So that's how this arose. And, because questions from readers, from customers, around the world asked for it. So I'd like to now introduce you briefly. You all, Alida, Dr. Alida Gersie. Where's Alida? Hello. Alida Gersie, we're privileged to have her. She wrote a wonderful foreword. And as she said, this book is a real gift and it matters a lot. Yeah. Alida is an art therapist, a drama therapist, and has written extensively on grieving. And if I can remember the name of her book, she'll remind us of it. And she's got various things to say. What was the book called, Alida?
Story Making in Bereavement.
Story Making in Bereavement. And there was something about a dragon?
Yeah, dragons fight in the meadow.
Dragons fight in the meadow. Well, thank you. So the second person is Yvonne Donohoe, and she's written a couple of stories, I think at least for the book, Sylvie and the Stars and Goodbye Shelley. And she's recently written a book called Soul Stripped Bare, Growing Through Grief. And she might tell us a bit more about that with Goodbye, Shelley. And finally, not last but not least, and first, is Susan Perrow, who probably needs no introduction. She's now ranging the world on Zoom after ranging the world doing storytelling, healing storytelling workshops all over the world, not just across her broad land of Australia. So Susan, over to you for the introduction and dedication. And again, thank you for all coming and making this such a warm celebration for your new book.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Alida and Yvonne, for joining me tonight, and for all of these wonderful people across the world for taking time to be with us. I would like to start with a cultural tribute. I'm going to read out of the introduction to this book. It's interesting, it's just a few paragraphs, but it actually took me days and weeks to write. I had different interviews with different cultural leaders. I read up a lot on how cultures for thousands of years have used stories with grief and loss. And I've put together these few words, and I think it's very appropriate that we begin with this. Out of deep respect for Indigenous cultures worldwide, it is important to honour the magnificence of the oral history. Before books, before writing, for thousands of years, many thousands of years, oral storytelling was integral to our humanity. In many Indigenous cultures, story embraced and still embraces everything, all life, connectedness, nature, and community. The stories and the storyteller stitched life and purpose and earth and sky together, mostly using images and motifs from the natural world, animals, birds, trees, mountains, clouds, stars, moon, and sun. In times of grief and loss, strength would be drawn from the stars, solace gained from sitting by a river, pain eased by walking through a forest. Stories were created that wove nature threads into healing journeys, and to this day continue to weave their healing work. The world has so much to learn from this wisdom. That's a foundation for any of this therapeutic story work that many of us are involved with around the world. And I would also just like to start by saying it's mixed emotions. It's very exciting to launch a book, but it's very different to launch this book because so many of the contributions and so many of the stories that I've written to help different families and situations, they are coming out of deep sadness and immense grief. So it's a mixture, and I really wanted to share that in the beginning, and it's possibly why, yes, it is very exciting to share this, but it's a mixture. And just to give you a brief overview, I'm just opening the table of contents here. This isn't a story just for grief and loss of a loved one, although that's a big part. And 34 contributors have mostly contributed to this section. It's also to do with loss of family connection, stories for children who've been adopted, who've been fostered, who've been separated in some way from family. Stories for the loss of a pet of different kinds. Stories for the loss of health and well-being. For the loss of place, of home and country. For some stories in here written for refugees by different contributors. And also, and it's quite a sad thing in our modern time to have to acknowledge this, but it seemed very important to include stories for environmental grief and loss. and just also general stories from different cultures on cycles of life and change. So it's covering many, many aspects of this theme. Yes. And 4 years, but really 30 years putting such a book together. And
so Susan,
yes.
What prompted you to write Stories to Light the Night? You said it's been 40 years, 30 years.
It began out of, yes, well, for the last 15, 16 years, I've been running seminars in different parts of the world to help people learn how to write therapeutic stories. And always this theme of grief and loss has come up. Sometimes someone might attend who wants to write a story for a child. They may want to write for themselves. There's people here tonight I'm recognizing across the screen of many faces that bring up some of those memories. And then often the question would come, when will that be a theme of one of your collections? And I resisted it for many years because I really didn't think I had it. I had the capacity to put such a book together. But it was when I put out an email to all my networks around the world, did anyone have some stories to share? And this is when people like Yvonne and the other 33 contributors from so many countries and cultures, from Mexico, Slovenia, China, the Philippines, Bulgaria. I'm going to be worried now I'm not mentioning them all, but so many countries. People came forward and shared different stories that they'd written to help. And when I say the word help, that's even a difficult word to use for this. It's quite easy to talk about behavior tales and to say perhaps a story helped change a behavior. With grief and loss, I think all we can hope is to offer some kind of whispering of some help.
Do you have
but there are many whisperings in this book, many beautiful, creative whisperings.
Do you have any examples of creative whisperings and the experiences people have had from the whisperings that stand out as treats to share?
I think because every example is so different, I'm actually just going to start by sharing a little about the first story in the book, out of the 94. And this was a story written by a teacher in Spain. She wrote it for her 5-year-old son, but also for her extended family, because just recently twins had been born prematurely. One twin survived and the other twin lived for a couple of days, was very weak and sick and didn't survive. And she was very aware. I'm just going to stop because Rosie, my friend Rosie from Cape Town, has just entered the waiting room. So I think we need to take time to please let her in. Thank you, Katie. I'm very happy. Martin knows all about Rosie, so we're very happy to greet Rosie. So back to this story. She wrote this story so that her 5-year-old wouldn't just have the picture of the sadness, of the fear, of the almost empty picture of a cousin dying. She wanted to give, in her words, she wanted to help her son build up an image that inspires love and acceptance of what had happened. Now that's a big ask, but she really did feel the story achieved this. And the way she wrote the story, she wrote it, most therapeutic stories, we work with metaphor. She wrote it about 2 little birds and the little birds lived in a nest so high up in a tree that the nest was in the stars. And these two little birds decided they wanted to come down into the world and smell the flowers and play in the grass. And so they came down, and one bird was very happy staying and meeting all the creatures in the world, but the other one just wanted to go back to the nest in the stars. And so the other one said goodbye to its brother bird and flew back up. Now, when this teacher shared this story with the 5-year-old boy, and the twins were called Thomas and Pablo, as soon as she shared the story, his response was immediate. He said to his mother, "Now Thomas will be able to see the stars from above, and Pablo see the stars from below." It's hard to capture these stories because on so many different levels they are working. But I think that is one wonderful example. There are many other stories through the book for other ages, for teenagers, for adults. There's such a range, but I think I should stop talking here and let my other two very special friends have a turn.
Before passing on to Alida, what's the story behind the title?
Well, that's a lovely way to bring in for many years I have lived and worked in Africa, and in a certain time when I was in East Africa, if people would find out that I wrote stories, occasionally I would get this wonderful response, Hadithi Mwanga Usiku, which is Kiswahili, that means stories shine in the night, or stories light the night. And that just spoke so deeply to me, because with this work with therapeutic stories, even for me as a parent and as a teacher, I remember the stories that I used. They did occasionally, with all the struggles that you have in your career and in your parenting, occasionally the stories really were like lights in the night. And so especially for this collection, I think
so thank you, Susan,
sure,
for that light in the night. So
well,
Alida,
thank you to Kenya.
So Alida, and I forgot to say that Alida is also the author of Storytelling for Environmental Education, one of Hawthorn's books. But Alida, why is this book important?
In several different ways. And first of all, and Martin and Yvonne, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I felt very honored that you embraced my presence in the book. That's really lovely that you did that. And for all of us who are here, my sense is that we are all adults who have been touched by grief and loss. That there is no way. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. That I think it's important that we honor that in ourselves. The fact that we have been touched by loss, and that for every child that has lost somebody, child being someone under 18, who has lost someone or a place or an animal or even an object that they deeply cared for, there are adults who are also grieving. And in that sense, every bereavement, every loss for a child creates double jeopardy. It's a double risk. It's a risk for the child, but it's also a risk for the adults that love the child. Now, this book is important because it helps the adults as well as the child. For the adults are often so thrown, so wounded, so hurt themselves, that it comes from the bottom of their souls to try and be a comfort, a guide, a light for the children that are hurting. And this book is there for all of them. It is there to help the grieving adult to find something to give, as Susan says, a whisper of help. But it also helps the child. And so it is way beyond the story that the book is important. Yes, the story matters. As Martin said, 1,000 pictures with a story. But those 1,000 pictures become opportunities for meeting. That's the best way I can put it. Opportunities for talk, opportunities for a passing reference when you're walking down the street. It creates a world in which survival is possible. And if there is one thing that is at stake for a child that grieves, is a belief that survival, never mind thriving, but that survival is possible. And then that within the survival, which in my part of the world you might call winter, that new growth can come, that thriving can come. And what is beautiful about the stories in this book is that they somehow manage to start in the darkness, but the darkness is normal. It's the night. It's an acceptable darkness, and it moves into the thriving, and it does so subtly, so carefully, so lovingly. There's a lot of love in this book. And when you're bereaved, you start to doubt that there is love. You start to doubt that there is survival. You start to doubt that there is goodness, that there is connection. And so all these things the book can give, bit by bit, a little bit here, a little bit there. But it's like cooking. You have little bits, and then you get a meal, and then you get a feeling of goodness all being well. That's what this book does. And it is necessary, because we in English use the word still quite a lot. A major disaster might happen, and 2 weeks later you hear on the radio they are still shocked. This book assumes that grief can be, and often is, a lifelong process. It demands adaptation for the rest of your life. But we can live with grief, we can live with mourning, we can live with bereavement, and we become other, and I personally believe, kinder and better people through embracing our grief. And that's what the book helps us to do. It puts a hug around our sorrow.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And Alida, thank you for your wonderful wisdom and love. And
Pleasure.
How do you envisage this book being used practically?
I think it's
from where you're coming.
I think there are several ways. One is give it as a present to anybody who has experienced a loss. I think it's a really good book to have in every home, as one of those books that you can get back to, because death happens. 1 in 5 children in this world live in war zones. There are close to 60 million people who are displaced and refugees. And many of those people will have children who have lost. Pets die in children's lives. There are an enormous number of losses. And with the environmental crisis happening, displacement is a word that many of us will not only know from reading, but will know from experience. And so this book is a backpack book. Then, in addition to that, that's the personal use. I think the professional use is that particularly teachers really need to have access to the book, so that they, for themselves, when they feel overwhelmed by what's happening in the class with their kids, nursery workers, youth workers, social workers, can dip into it in order to develop a language of consolation. They may be making up their own stories. Susan's introduction is very helpful in that regard, but they can also borrow the stories, build on the stories, live with the stories, use what Susan referred to earlier, our deep sense of storytelling. So personally, I think really it's a book that could and should be in most households, and I would say make it a gift or make it a purchase. Secondly, professionally, I think that social workers, youth workers, teachers, nurses particularly, play workers, play therapists would be very wise to have the book in their reference little library. You know, as a professional, you travel with a few books. This is one of those books to travel with.
Thank you. Thank you.
As
a publisher, I love hearing when somebody says that every home needs a book like this.
Yeah, so I think it do.
So thank you. So just to move on to Yvonne. Yvonne, thank you very much for contributing to the panel. And we'd be delighted if you could please talk about the story in the book, Goodbye Shelley, and its connection to your own personal situation of grief and loss. And you have written a book about this, I know, but perhaps you could tell us the Goodbye Shelley story.
Okay. Just before I do, I would also like to personally thank Susan. I've been a teacher for over 40 years, so I have worked with many children throughout those years who have experienced loss. I'm a mother and a grandmother, so I think this is such an essential book. And I agree with you, Alida, it must be in every school, library, in every home, just as a resource for those times. Like, we don't want those times to be happening, but they do happen because that is life. And yes, Martin, I drew on several things. When Susan put out her email for friends and colleagues to contribute to the book, we had suffered a loss. My son, my youngest son, was killed by a drunk driver 10 years ago. So for years, those years I've been, you know, on that journey of grief. And at first I just wanted the pain to stop, but then I realized that the grief was the gift that was going to help my heart to heal. And that's what I've been exploring in my book that you mentioned earlier. I'd also attended one of Susan's courses. As a teacher, I wanted to know how to go about creating stories for children. So when the email came into my inbox, I wanted to draw on what I'd learned through the course. I wanted to draw on my own personal experience, and I also wanted to draw on the research that I'd been doing for my book. I'd invited other parents to share about their personal experience of losing a child. So I was gathering all of that, and I thought, how do I turn all this into a story for a child? So Goodbye Shelley is about a young girl who's geographically isolated. She lives on a farm. So she has a treasured possession, which is a shell. And the shell becomes her confidant. She talks to the shell. She shares her secrets with the shell. And when she visits her grandparents who live at the ocean, she takes the shell back for a little holiday. And in Australia, all children know, you know, experience the beach. And it's just an ordinary day where Shelley's at the beach with her shell, and she's built a sand castle, and she's put the shell inside the sand castle. And then she goes off exploring the rock pools, as most children do in Australia. So it's quite set in that, you know, a typical beach scene in Australia. What happens while she's exploring the rock pool is that the tide comes in, and she's so engrossed with what she's doing, she doesn't notice that the tide's coming in. Now, for me, this was quite relevant because a big wave comes and washes away her treasured possession. So it was that unpreparedness for loss. And that's what we were thrown into the world of grief. And I wanted to capture that, but for a child, because of course that can happen to a child who might lose a parent suddenly, or, you know, a pet who gets run over or something like that. So I wanted to capture that. The other thing I wanted to bring in, this girl, Shelley, is about 10 years old, and right at that age where you're becoming quite self-conscious and, you know, trying to be cool and act quite grown up, she ends up on her grandmother's lap on the beach, just crying like a baby. And I wanted to show that that's okay, that emotions are really normal and it's okay to be sad. And I thought that was really important for this child to be able to express her grief at the loss of her treasured possession without feeling self-conscious. The other thing that was really important was that I wanted to weave in some of the wisdom that I'd been learning through my own grief experience and through gathering information from other parents. Some of the parents who contributed had lost babies, had miscarriages, and they said that some people would say to them, oh, you can always have another baby. And they would say how terrible that was, because they didn't want another baby. They just wanted that baby. So I tried to weave the wisdom in through the grandmother who did not say to Shelley, you can always find another Shell. She didn't say that. Instead, she talked about memory making and the things they could do. So I was trying to bring in some of the wisdom for the level of a child. So I was bringing in all those elements or trying
And
to.
She did it so beautifully.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yvonne, do you have a question for Susan?
I do actually, Martin. I'm just so intrigued by the categories of loss. We know there are so many ways we can experience loss which causes us to grieve. Susan, I'd love you to share a little bit or give some insight into how you chose those categories or how they were developed. Was it the chicken or the egg? Was it because the stories came and they to the categories? Or I'd love to hear some about that. Thank you.
Well, this gives me a chance to thank a writers group that I've been part of for quite a few years. We dared to call ourselves the Binklings, which was Byron Bay version of the Inklings, which any English person would know. The famous writers belong to the Inklings. And we thought that if we called ourselves that, that might help us all rise to the... And it was like a family, how we nursed each other with our writing. And we could either read, we had about half hour each. We could either read something we'd written, or we could discuss a plan for a book, or, you know, what were we going to call the book? However, we could use our time. And quite a few times in a row, I would go along with huge bits of paper, putting all of these thoughts of how to come up with such a book. And then it was the other members of the writers group said, oh, but what about this? And you haven't even talked about loss of time or loss of respect or loss of health. And so there were quite a few things that I just hadn't even thought of. And so I'm adding and then recategorizing and trying to find a way to even word the categories, which would seem it's also sensitive. And I think in the beginning, I just had death of a loved one, and my writers group just jumped on me. You can't put that. So they helped. People coming to my seminars helped with their different thoughts. Plus, I get emails probably at least one a week, if not more, and I'm getting them from different situations around the world. Do I have a story for this, or could I write a story to help with a particular situation? It might be a family where the children can't see the father anymore because the father has been abusive, and yet the children are blaming the mother who's protecting them from the father. Very complicated situations. This loss of family connection. Could I write a story that could speak to these children and help them understand. And so then with many walks on the beach, Yvonne lives on the same beach that I do, those long beach walks, and just that situation. All right, we've got this mother who's like the captain of a family ship, and she's the one who has to steer it through all the different rocky journeys and difficult passageways, and the children helping as the crew. Yes, fed from many areas. And I guess really, if we go back, starting with that first book, I have to thank Nancy Mellon here for introducing me to Martin with my first collection, and just building up this network. Yes, all feeding in.
Thank you.
Can't hear you, Martin. Someone's muted you.
Oh dear.
Yes,
Zoom,
there we are.
Zoom 101, I failed.
Yes.
You mentioned healing stories for challenging behavior, which
Yes.
I loved, the secret to tidy bedrooms and much more.
Yeah.
However, what's the difference between writing stories, especially for challenging behavior or children with difficulty, and stories for grief and loss? Because they are qualitatively different, aren't they?
Yes, yes, very different. And I think it's, I've learned a lot in this new area of work. It was something I resisted for a while, working with a difficult behavior. I mean, you can't simplify anything, but to try and explain it simply, you may have a behavior that's out of balance for the age group. Perhaps there's a child who's being very aggressive to the other children in the class, or stealing things from others in the class. And the story finds a journey, an imaginative journey, to lead from the out of balance situation, the stealing, to the more balanced, honest, sharing approach. So you could almost, someone pointed out, because of my love of mathematics, it's almost a mathematical approach, even though it's not quite right to describe a story like that. But here we have situations that sometimes just need a gentle reflection. Others need what Yvonne was explaining, the use of these deep wisdoms, but deep wisdoms that have come out of such sad, grieving situations. And you also can't hope to heal a difficult behavior. It's not the same. You're not trying to, you certainly can't bring back the loss. But you can find ways, some of the stories in this book find ways to introduce activities. For example, loss of a pet. And I have one story in there with a girl who's lost her little dog, and the parents involve her with planting a tree over the ground where the dog was buried, and a little song they make up to sing. And so some ritual, some different activities are built into some of these stories. But mainly that it's just more of a whispering rather than a bold, yes, this story can make a difference. Maybe it can just make a tiny whisper of help and hope.
So I love the memory blanket story, for example, the class knitting a memory blanket.
Down the south coast through those bushfires, yes, and all the children in the class. Thank you. That this is another contributor. All the children in the class knitting squares, and as they're knitting, bringing in the conversations of the difficult times they've been through. Where some of those towns were almost fully burnt to the ground. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Difficult.
Mm.
So that sends me tingly, that story. Thank you. And Susan, does your story approach for grieving and loss resonate with adults? What have been your experiences there?
Metaphor speaks to all ages. There's no age group that metaphor doesn't speak to. And because metaphor is the key to these therapeutic stories, yes. I don't have as many experiences and as many stories in the collection for adults as I do for children and families. But as Alida pointed out, it's also interconnected. But for one quick example comes to mind, a lovely story written from Slovenia to help aging parents who had to move out of their grand home. So it was a story to do with loss of a home. They had to move out of their home and into a smaller place. Now that is a big loss for someone as they get older. And she wrote this beautiful story. It was about a stork that had the grand nest in the village, but a storm came and the nest got blown apart and the stork had to rebuild. And it had, the only place it could rebuild was in this big tree where there were many other nests, quite a mirroring of an apartment building, many nests in an apartment building. But then the writer brought in this beautiful image at the end that even though the nest was smaller, the stork found some lavender threads, lavender flowers, and wove them in very caringly wove them in to this new little nest. Metaphors through cultures for thousands of years have often shared a truth, reached the, certainly spoken to the heart, much more deeply and directly than straightforward facts can do.
Thank you for a wonderful story. Thank you. We've perhaps got 5 more minutes, depending when John comes in with the glasses to clink. But yes. I would like to ask Alida, what do you think adults can do to help children who have experienced a significant loss? And I know from the editorial process how concerned you are about children who've experienced the loss of a father or mother.
Thank you. Yeah, in the foreword, I give a few basics of what we as adults might be able to do for a child that has experienced a loss. My knowledge, my sense, my experience, my lived experience of childhood loss, childhood bereavement, is that probably the most important thing is that someone stays around, that someone is there quite constantly. And it really doesn't matter that much whether it's a neighbor, whether it's an aunt, whether it's a brother, but someone holds that unit. It might be a family, might be a child alone, might be a little group, holds them steady and remains around. That, I think, is the most important thing, that somewhere there is a stable adult. And that adult isn't there for today, gone tomorrow, doesn't provide psychological first aid, and then is another one that disappears. It could be a teacher, could be a youth worker, but that someone is there and in a way holds the storms, holds the whole process. If that person is someone who is also deeply affected by the grief, then it's really important that that person has support, because grieving alone is really hard, and grieving alone is not necessary if only we can learn to talk. I've worked for many, many years in palliative care where children are dying and where the families need it a lot and deserved the support of their community. But that community was often speechless. And so the other next thing is, yes, do handicrafts, absolutely, knit, embroider, build sandcastles, make things with these hands, because yes, we have the stories and they matter, but cooking matters. Making a cup of tea together matters. Making the bed together matters. So use your hands for whatever, for a little bit of making. So be there, do something with your hands, be silent, but also chat. And especially with kids, accept that children will 1 minute be really upset and the next minute be running around and really giggling and laughing, and then 10 minutes later, so know about what is, how children grieve in general and how this specific child grieves in one way, and differentiate that from the way adults grieve. Adults can tolerate pain for much longer than children. Children are much more likely to go up and down and up and down and not sleep, have pains and aches and so on. So be there, give them information, talk about death, and help them to make something that is their responsibility, and differentiate very clearly what they can fix, what they together with you can fix, and what others must sort out. That's part of the adult world. I think that's kind of it. But it's not it. There's so much more to it. But if you're stuck for just a few things, be there, make something, know what's normal for a kid in their grieving, and above all, assure them that you're going to try to be around for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. Susan, have you picked up a burning question from the chat, or should I ask you your last question, as it's nearly 5 to...
I've hardly had time to look at the chat. I've been so absorbed in the wonderful sharings from Alida and Yvonne. And also we're getting fairly close to the hour. So how about sorry to anyone who has put questions. I'm always open for you to email me, and you'll find that on my website. But yes, I would like to end with that last question we discussed, Martin.
So why are stories important? Why do they matter in this time?
Mm-hmm. When I was living in Southern Africa, I heard a wonderful quote from the Bushman people that live there. And they say, a story is like the wind. It comes from a far off place and you feel it. And I think the most direct answer is that stories matter because we feel them with our hearts, not our heads. And in our world today, so often the head, or is what sometimes referred to as the left brain, can be the dominant sibling in our balanced human way that we should learn and know about the world. And so stories help to bring out, they speak to our hearts. And just for that simple reason, they are so important. And in our today's world, with so many situations needing healing, needing help, Jane Goodall said it all at the United Nations Forum a couple of years ago. Don't talk to the politicians and the policy makers with facts, share stories. We have to reach people's hearts to make a difference. So that's why stories matter.
Thank you. And thank you. I think it may be up to 150 people have participated in this wonderful global conference. And you are all storytellers. So yeah. I hope you will pass the stories on that you've heard here and from the book. And the question is how to get hold of the book. Susie Emery has put in the chat how you can order the book from Hawthorn Press, from our website, but also it's free postage if you order by the end of March. And there are various distributors, like in Australia, Woods Lane, that distribute it. Mm-hmm. But do feel free. Now, some questions.
And if I can just add, please, in Australia, the libraries are stocking up, and if your library doesn't have the book, please let them know that it exists. And I just in my local library system, they're ordering 12 or more copies, and that way it can really get out to everyone, especially those who can't afford it.
And thank you for various people have interested their country's publishers in translating the book. And we got interest in Stories to Light the Night from Brazil, from Serbia, Croatia, Turkey, Spain, maybe China. And so the method is to get enthusiastic, contact a publisher, say there's all these people that are interested in this approach, organize a Zoom seminar and conference with Susan like now, and get your publisher to attend. For example, Ebru sounds like a wonderful kindergarten teacher from Istanbul. I've put her into contact with a publisher who's published our storytelling books in Turkey. So do foment a publication in your country, and we can help with that, and Susan can help with that. So, but finally, a riddle to send you away with. The answer is pretty obvious, but you probably know the riddle already. What is it that when you give it away, you keep it? It moves from place to place and changes as it moves. Without it, there is no past or future, no reason or meaning. What is it? So I'll leave you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for Susan. And I hope the glasses are about to clink.
But just one quick thing, Martin, I love the riddle. But Martin, I haven't had a chance. Many years ago, I don't know that Martin had ever published an Australian before. And I thank Martin for his trust and support from the bottom of my heart. Thank you to Hawthorn Press. So my husband has arrived. You're having bubbles in the morning. How wonderful. Well,
wow.
And Yvonne's about to come up.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
You more. Congratulations to you.
Goodbye.
Rob.
To all our friends out there.
Thank you
Bye,
for
Martin.
go well. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.